Hi everyone, it's William, trying to keep my voice down again because, again, beautiful sunny day. I'm on the balcony and lots of people have come up, either hiked up or taken the funicular up to Schatzalp to enjoy the day. And I'm not quite sure how to introduce this series this time because I am going to try something new, and that is to do 6 days worth of entries from 1939 because Dmitri was not writing at length in his diary at that time, to say the least, as you'll see, and then do also one entry from 1915. And if that seems rather nonsensical, then I would say it's justified for a few reasons, both because it's convenient and because people have expressed interest in both of those years, but also because there's a certain, at least at this point in January 1915, there's a certain connection, because Dmitri was off in a sort of isolated place doing a rest cure, more or less, a kind of variation of a rest cure because of supposed illness. And there were also wars going on in both instances. And in both instances, he was about 2 years away, a little less in 1915, and a little more in 1939, from departing one world and entering another that was dramatically different. So, in December 1916, he would be booted out of Russia because of the Rasputin assassination, and then the revolution would ensue, and he would never be able to return to Russia, and that old way of life would simply be gone with the wind. I've just been watching that movie, and it seems an apt phrase to describe what happened after the Russian Revolution to people. That entire way of life was just gone. And I'm not making any value judgment on that, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Well, in one instance, it was definitely a good thing with respect to the U.S. Civil War. But anyway, once again, putting my foot in my mouth, I suppose. Anyway, yeah, there was that parallel. And of course, when I say he would be entering a whole new world in 1942, well, that's one way of putting it, I guess, since I personally believe in life after death, but whether you do or you don't, maybe you can't say he was entering a whole nother world, but you could say he was definitely leaving one. So those are the kind of parallels that I think make it an interesting juxtaposition. And, we've seen him at age 14. We've seen him at age 29. And now we're going to see him at age 23 and age 48 at the same time. So that's an interesting comparison, I think. All right. So, as for the diaries, I was wrong, as I so often am, because of my faulty memory and because of not taking the time to look at things before I talk. So the diary, he was writing it in at this time of his arrival at Schatzalp. He was keeping it, even though he was in bed. So what we have today, and he had this very small pocket diary, and he was actually doing what most people do instead of what he was doing in the earlier volume of diaries, in that he was day by day writing down about that day that was actually occurring. He seems to have written at night before he went to bed, and he's just sort of jotting down notes sometimes. Other times he goes more at length, but these quite a bit more at length. But these first 6 are, they're very short, and you can compare them to what we had in the letter of 23rd September, and see that we had the details from the letter, and now we just have the things, not that he's sending to his sister, but that he's just jotting down for himself. Okay, so we can start with that. So, starting 31st August 1939, which was a Thursday. Frightfully ill in Paris, dined with Pauline and Maria, left at 9:50, normal, though dark. So, yeah, we read about his final dinner with Maria and the mysterious Pauline, and how horrible he was feeling at that time. He left at 9:50. We know he took a night train, so that was really quite late. What I don't understand is what he means when he says normal, comma, though dark. What the heck does that mean? I just don't have a clue. Anyway, 1st September 1939, a Friday, Davos, Hotel d'Angleterre, arrived absolutely normal. Hitler has gone into Poland. A European war is inevitable. Okay, again, the whole normal thing. I'm not sure what he means. He told Maria in the letter that things were far from normal in Davos because of the mobilization of Swiss men. But maybe he meant, well, I don't know what he means. Go figure. 2nd September 1939, Saturday, Hotel d'Angleterre, Davos, 11:30 appointment with the doctor at Schatzalp. It went all right. Coughing frightfully and constant sputum from my throat. I don't know if it's pronounced sputum or sputum. Well, it's an inconvenient word either way. So this is a little bit more information than we had in the letter to Maria about how on that particular day he was coughing heavily and spitting. 3rd September 1939, Sunday, first night in the sauna. Frightful sputum from my throat, temperature 39, no comment there. 4th September 1939, Monday, more sputum and coughing, temperature 37 to 38, and then a word I can't make out, followed by at night. So I don't know, but his temperature has gone down. So maybe because he was in such an anxious state, and also because of his exertion in traveling from Paris to Davos, maybe that's why his temperature had been so high. And now that he was on bed rest, already after one day it had gone down. 5th September 1939, Tuesday, I weigh only 60.8. It's a little low, but I must at all costs get better. Okay, so an echo of what we've already heard him say to Maria. And now let us go onward to 1915, and we have the 1st of January, 1915, on the old Julian calendar, so New Year's Day. But on the Western calendar, in the rest of the world, it was the 14th of January. Or I should say on the Gregorian rather than the Western calendar, it was the 14th. But for Dmitri, it was the 1st. So he's at the estate Usovo. It's 5 degrees below zero, and he writes, absolutely quiet. I got up around 10 o'clock. Yesterday night was sad. We all just sat around, GM, Borya, and myself. Then at 11 o'clock, we went our separate ways, and there was no more interaction. Could I have imagined that I would spend New Year's Eve in Usovo and live to see it through? I lunched at 1 o'clock with GM Borya, the Usovo priest, and the manager. Cook arrived just in time to join us. He's aged a little, but overall is unchanged. After lunch, I went skiing with Cook on the hill by the church. Naturally, I fell several times. We stayed outside until 5 o'clock when we went in for tea. Then we descended again in the darkness from the hill built near the house and covered with ice. Because of the darkness, I couldn't see the road and took a nasty spill. I fell from the sleigh and injured both knees, especially the right one. I fell from the sled and injured both knees, especially the right one. We dined Akat, GM, Borya, Cook, and myself at 8 o'clock. Then we sat around in my apartment. Tea was served around 11 o'clock. I went to bed early, so if you can't understand my horrible French, Akat, by which I mean to say 4. There were 4 at dinner. This is his way of saying there were 4 of us. Okay, so let's see. The question, of course, which we'll be exploring is, unlike in 1939, is this a psychosomatic illness? He will end up having surgery at his own palace, a sort of, minor surgery, I guess. They didn't use anesthesia, but it seems to have been more a kind of depression. So maybe not all the way down to the sort of black depression, although God knows he might have been in that state before he arrived at Usovo, and there's no 1914 diary, but he apparently had not been at Usovo very long. And, you will hear his diary entries after this, where he describes what he's feeling physically, and then you can make up your own mind about that. Of course, he had very much had a trauma. So many people had, right? So what can you say? It didn't single him out for, oh, you poor thing. He was in a just horrific, nasty battle where I think it was 50% casualties among not the men, but the officers, if you can imagine. With the men, it was, or was it 50% with the men? Anyway, the horse guards was just decimated, or more than decimated, the regiment. And Dmitri was there, and he was decorated for his participation in that battle, for allegedly, according to Maria, saving a non-commissioned officer by getting off his horse and pulling this man to safety. Anyway, that's somewhat disputed. Another version is that he rode with dispatches, but either way, several of his close friends were killed, and it was basically a battle of German artillery versus Russian cavalry. So you can imagine what he would have seen, even if he'd just been sitting on the sideline smoking a cigarette, which he wasn't. But even if he had been, they still would have been horrifically traumatic. So he was one of the many who were shell-shocked to a greater or lesser degree at that time. And then you can ask the question, was it justified for him to be, especially, if it's just a psychosomatic illness, is it justified for him to be away from everything? And as you know later, whether she had ulterior motives because of Rasputin or not, Alexandra kept urging Nicholas not even to keep Dmitri at headquarters, but to send him back into the thick of things, or at least to send him back to his regiment. But if I recall correctly from what I read years ago in the correspondence between Nicholas and Alexandra, Dmitri had had a premonition of his own death and was in a very poor psychological state, and Nicholas was always sensitive to that in him. Anyway, that was the situation. And, how can we judge? He was extraordinarily privileged. Other officers and certainly other soldiers didn't have the option to go and do a rest cure in the middle of the war. But on the other hand, if any of us had been involved in it and if had that option, or had a son who had that option, would we not have taken it? I think most of us would have. So anyway, Usovo was the winter estate, very near to Ilinskaya, neighboring estates, and it was, I think, smaller and easier to heat than the building, the Ilinskaya manor. And so when they went out to the Moscow countryside, the countryside outside of Moscow on the Moscow River, when they went in the winter, they went to Usovo and not to Ilinskaya. So at this point, it belongs to Dmitri, and that is where he's been sent for this sort of rest cure. And it was where his father, Paul, and other members of the family thought he should be sent after the Rasputin assassination. So Felix Yusupov had been sent to his country estate, and they thought, or one of them, and the family thought that Dmitri should be sent to Usovo. So, but he wasn't, as we know. Anyway, he's definitely bored, as well as depressed. There's this odd comment to, he wouldn't have thought that he hadn't imagined that he would be spending New Year's Eve in Usovo, but that's not strange. But then, and live to see it through, what the heck does he mean by that? Did he think he was dying before he went to do this rescue, or does he mean that if he'd been back at the front, he might not have lived to see the new year? I don't know. I think you all know who George Mikhailovich Laming, Georgy Mikhailovich Laming is, especially those of you who have watched the videos for 1904, or 1906, 1907. He was Dmitri's main caregiver, tutor, but more than a tutor. Governor, except we don't use that word. We use the word governess, but not governor. Anyway, someone extremely close to Dmitri and important to him. He was 49 years old at that age. At that time, he was sent to be with Dmitri in Usovo. He would not be sent to be with Dmitri in Persia. That was not allowed. Okay, and then his son, Borya was his son, Boris Georgievich Laming. He was 17 or 18 at the time, so just about ripe to begin his wartime military service. I don't know if he ended up doing that or not. Then we have the priest of the Usovo church, Konstantin Georgievich Makhayev. He was 72 years old. Other than that, I don't know anything about him. We have the manager of the estate. I don't know anything about him, not even a name. And we have the mysterious cook. So my colleagues in Russia haven't been able to find anything about Cook either. You will remember him, I think, from the 1907, not the 1906, but the 1907 diaries when Dmitri was in Moscow. And yeah, it's an English name, C-O-O-K. And he seems to have been one of the men who, from adolescence on, was attached to Dmitri to be male role models and to bring him up to be a proper man and Grand Duke. So he has newly arrived here in Usovo, and Dmitri will be mentioning him, if you recall, later on, because in the October 27th, 1939 letter to Dmitri, to Maria, Dmitri refers to him as one of the people that he had to rely on as a boy, and comparing that to the people that Polly has to rely on and who he will be cut off from if he is indeed sent to the United States. So anyway, Cook was important to Dmitri, and I almost wonder if he was sent there to get him more active, to get him more, instead of doing a rescue, to get him outside and doing physical activities for a good part of the day. Maybe. I don't know. I really don't. That may have been at Dmitri's own initiative, but I don't know. Maybe that's why Cook was sent, to sort of, get him back on the right track. Okay, it's funny that the first thing he says about Cook is that he's aged, but otherwise he's not changed. So if you watch the 1921 diary videos, you'll see that he said that constantly. Every person he saw that he hadn't seen for a while, that's always the first thing he says. It's the first thing he said about Coco, and most of the people that he had, the Russians that were making their way to Europe, it's always the same thing. He's aged or she's aged. But other than that, no changes. So that makes me laugh. Anyway, so he wasn't doing very well as far as staying on his skis and on his sled. He fell off, hurt his knees, poor chap. And what do we have next time? Well, we'll find out more about what his mental and physical state is, and both at Schatzalp in 1939 and at Usovo in 1915. Now, he's not going to be spending the whole of 1915 at Usovo. In fact, he's not going to be there that much longer. So we'll have diary entries from him in Moscow and also Petrograd, as it was then called, So don't worry about him being in this quiet, sort of withdrawn state, both in 1915 and 1939. That will not be the case. And yeah, come back. Let me know what you think of this new approach. If you find it too distracting, yeah, let me know. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.